Thank you so much for coming, Jason. I've been trying to get you. It's so nice to see you. I'm a big fan of Roots of Progress. All of your writing, your presentations, it really puts into perspective how progress has been happening in society. Your posts about instant stone, instant bread, and like all your posts are really great. And so, first of all, I really wanted to start with one quote that, I mean, Peter Thiel has been talking about stagnation. He has this motto that instead of flying cars, we got 140 characters, and there has been stagnation in the physical world. And instead of flying cars, right, we have this progress only in the world of bits. That's what he says. Do you agree with this point, or do you believe that you might be overlooking something?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be having the conversation. Yeah, as to Teal's point about stagnation, I was initially skeptical of this point and eventually came around to basically agreeing with it. Um, I don't love the formulation of flying cars versus 140 characters. I think that it's catchy, but it also kind of risks trivializing some of the progress that has happened in communications. Um, and it makes you part of why I was originally skeptical about this idea was that it seemed to be dismissing out of hand all of the progress in computing and the internet, and it seemed to be saying, all right, well, if you subtract out computers and the internet, what progress have we made? And it's kind of like asking, well, except for all the progress, where do we see any progress? And it so that argument, when I first heard it, didn't really make sense to me. But I think there's a way to put it, which the bits versus atoms is a little more clear. Um, I think what really made me come around to this point of view is studying the history of progress and basically deciding that it's not about bits versus atoms. It's about the fact that we've had progress in only bits when we really should have had progress in both bits and atoms at the same time. Or sometimes I like to say bits, atoms, cells, and joules. So things like manufacturing and construction are the atoms. Joules refers to energy, and cells refers to biology. We really ought to be having progress on all fronts at once. And what's happened is that we've had uneven progress, where progress has continued to race ahead on some fronts while slowing down, and we've seen stagnation on other fronts. Now, when I first started studying progress, I wondered, well, maybe that's just how progress happens. Maybe there's kind of a fire hose of progress, and it gets pointed at one area or another, whatever is the most high ROI area. Maybe that's where all the resources flow into, and we make progress on that one thing for a while, and then we come around. But when I started looking at the history of progress, I realized that's not the case. We actually can make progress on all fronts at once. And the proof of this is really the late 19th and early 20th century. In the, say, 50 years from 1870 to 1920, just to pick a relatively arbitrary time period, we had, by my count, approximately 5 major revolutions or big breakthroughs on 5 fronts. We had our own equivalent of computers and the internet, which was the telephone and radio, both point-to-point and broadcast communications. That was our information revolution. 2, we had an energy revolution with electricity, electric lights, generators, and motors. The whole grid, the whole industry was developed during this time. 3, we had a second energy revolution with the internal combustion engine, and that led to a transportation revolution with the automobile and the airplane. 4, there was a revolution in synthetic chemistry and applied chemistry. We got synthetic plastics, synthetic fertilizer, and a bunch of things like that. And then number 5 was really in the germ theory and public health. We got some of the first vaccines, and we also got water filtration and sanitation that made our water much safer to drink. Started to get better food handling practices and hygiene practices, and started to really bring down mortality rates from infectious disease. So all 5 of those things were going on at once in that period. And today, we've basically had, again, progress in computers and the internet. We've had some really interesting progress in genetic engineering, although it feels like we've barely scratched the surface of what's possible there. And then, manufacturing, construction, energy, and transportation have really kind of lagged behind. And while there's been plenty of incremental improvements in those areas, we're still doing things in fundamentally the same ways that we were doing them at the end of the 1960s. We're still flying in fundamentally the same jet planes. In fact, they even fly a little slower these days. We got the Concorde briefly, but then it was shut down, and it was never widely accessible or affordable. We're still generating energy in pretty much the same ways. The nuclear revolution never happened. New technologies like solar are really starting to take off, but they're still very tiny. Manufacturing, construction, still the same basic techniques. We've had some new materials. So, it's not as if there's been zero progress in these areas, but compared to the past, it's really just, it's a slowdown. There's no way around it.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Talking about sanitation, my grandfather, I'm from Brazil, he created the first sanitation plant or what have you in Brazil, which is interesting. Back then, there wasn't as much sanitation, and still there are parts of the world that there is not, which is something that we should look forward to improve. You talked a little bit about progress in the past, and there were so many major areas of progress in the past in these different areas. But has progress happened in bursts? Meaning, okay, uh, there were times in history where you had in the case that you mentioned, there were like 5 areas. Were there bursts where in time of history of like this where progress has happened, or has it been a constant and just recently that we start to see some slowness in some areas? How has progress evolved in history?
If you zoom out enough, I think it's been pretty constant. If you zoom in on certain places and times, yes, there have been in the past what are sometimes called efflorescences, a brief flourishing of creativity and invention. Sometimes that's in science, sometimes in invention, sometimes it's in the arts, as in Renaissance Florence, let's say. So you do see these brief golden ages where for a couple decades or a generation, maybe one city or region will have some confluence of geniuses who come together and do amazing things for a while, and then it burns out. The amazing thing about the Industrial Revolution was that it was a highly inventive period that did not end. It kept going. And I think that's where I say if you zoom out, the really sort of big picture of progress, it actually looks smoother. And the little bumps kind of get smoothed out. And what we see, the high level pattern of all of the history of human progress is that progress accelerates over time. It's not even just an exponential curve where things get better at a constant rate, a constant percentage each year. It is actually the rate of growth actually increases over time. Whether it increases smoothly or in discrete jumps, I'm not entirely sure. But in the last 150, 250 years, the growth rate has been higher than it was, in the Middle Ages, and then it was higher than it was in antiquity, and then it was higher than it was in prehistory, and then it was higher than it was in, the hunter-gatherer era. But there was progress even in the hunter-gatherer era. In fact, even in the pre-Homo sapiens era, millions of years ago, before our species fully evolved, the first stone tools were in use by our hominin ancestors. And you can see progress even in stone tools over millions of years. But they used the same stone tools as far as we can tell for like a million years. And then maybe there'd be some new evolution of the tools, and then the evolution gets more rapid, and then we get into the agricultural era, and then things are moving faster, and then by the industrial era, things are moving extremely rapidly. But that is sort of the high level picture of just things keep getting faster because as we make progress, it enables us to make more progress faster. We get better at making progress as we have more science and technology and wealth and infrastructure and more people and better institutions and so on and so forth.
Interesting. So you mentioned a few areas where we haven't improved recently as much. And I think one of the, I think the, I mean, for me, the most interesting post on Roots of Progress is about the Where's My Flying Car. I talked to the author of Where's My Flying Car, and I agree with his thesis around progress and everything. But I think one of the most interesting graphs is the Adams curve, right? The production of energy and over time, and until a certain point, a period of time, it was growing, I think, exponentially, and then it level off. And it, it clearly stopped. We stopped producing as much energy, and that might be one of the reasons why we don't have flying cars. I mean, like I think Stores argues that flying cars require a lot of energy, and energy right now is expensive because there's not as much supply. We don't build, like, we don't create as much energy. And I mean, if you look at the Adams curve, it's very clear that that has stopped. um, are there any theories of why we stop producing as much energy or growing as fast as we were in the past? And can the deployment of solar energy, or even, we're starting to see nuclear fusion, like there seems to be some progress there. Nuclear fission with the small modular reactors might reduce, the cost of each one of them, and then you can create a nice feedback loop. But can those also help, go back to the trend that we had in the past?
Yeah. So yeah, you're talking about what J. Stores Hall calls the Henry Adams curve, because it was mentioned in Henry Adams' autobiography, and it is, yeah, the exponential growth in per capita energy usage or in total energy usage. Both are growing exponentially, or were in the United States up until about 1970, at which point per capita energy usage flatlined and has been, pretty much level ever since. Why did this happen? If I could point to one simple core reason, it's because we decided we didn't want to build any more energy capacity. We kind of, or society decided that, or some subset of society decided that, and they got their way. I think it was so that point, 1970 or early 1970s, 71, 73, around there, seems to be a turning point. There are a whole lot of different graphs that all have some kind of inflection point or change in the trend right around there. In fact, this is so prominent that somebody came up with a website called WTF Happened in 1971, I think. And if you search, you can find it and find a whole bunch of interesting graphs. Now, I'm not certain that they're all connected, but I do think there was something significant. Part of what was significant was the counterculture and the environmentalist movement were coming to were really rising into prominence. The first Earth Day was right around there. NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, was passed right around then, 70 or 71, can't remember. And that was quite significant. The purpose of NEPA really was to allow for a certain level of obstructionism. That may not be, I don't know, some people might not consider that a charitable way of putting it, but I think that, really the motivation was that it was too easy for the federal government to build things or to allow things to be built, and that there should be more process in front of this to sort of, if you wanted to put it the most charitably, to make sure we are considering environmental impacts. But the reality of that is, what it means is that we do more studies, which means taking more time, slowing things down, adding to the schedule and to the budget of everything, and giving things more chances to get delayed and ultimately sometimes canceled. So we deliberately made it more expensive to build almost anything. And NEPA has really spiraled out of control. I recommend reading Eli Dorado's explainer on NEPA, where he points out that where it has landed today, and the size, the length of the environmental impact statements that are generated, even the number of I forget the term for it, but essentially the findings of no impact, the statement you have to file if you're not going to have an impact. The amount of paperwork that is done for all that is orders of magnitude beyond what it used to be, and what presumably anyone envisioned when they passed this law. It's not clear that Congress ever intended for environmental impact statements to be thousands of pages and to take years, literally years, to assemble, and who knows how many man years went into that. The original ones were relatively brief, and just over time and through lawsuit after lawsuit, they've crept up and up. So that's why it's very hard. I mean, that's one piece, and that and similar things like it are a big part of why it's very hard to build pretty much anything in the country today. Especially infrastructure, and that includes energy infrastructure, both the generation and the transmission lines. Even if you could build a power plant today, you have a hard time connecting it to the grid. So, and again, underlying that was a view that all of this material progress, industrial progress, was not true human progress at all. That it was a sort of false progress, where we were increasing our capabilities, but at the destruction of the environment, or at a cost to individual human lives, or so the thinking went. I mean, I don't agree with that framing, but if you look at court decisions from that time, there was one of the early NEPA decisions says that essentially NEPA was passed in order to control at long last the destructive engine of material, quote unquote, progress. So, if when progress is viewed as a destructive engine, then people get to work trying to stop it. And so I think both at a cultural level, in terms of attitudes and what people were saying about industrial progress in the media, in popular culture, starting to see it in education and in school and political rallies, and then also at the political level in terms of legal legislation and regulation that was going on. I think those things really combined to and then, by the way, there was an oil shock in 1973, right? And so that energy got very expensive for a while, and I think a bunch of people decided the thing to do was to just try to use less energy. Which, there's a famous, I don't remember I might be getting this wrong, but didn't Carter appear in a sweatshirt and told everybody to turn down the thermostat, right? Basically conserve, right? Save energy. So rather than solving our problems and in order to create more infrastructure, more wealth, more technology, more capabilities, more comfort and convenience for everybody, higher standards of living, we just decided maybe this is it. And maybe we should retreat, roll back, give up essentially the fight for progress, and not actually try to create so much, not try to make so much in material progress. And so it was really a sense of, I think, defeatism and fatalism that crept in. And there was there's a term that's used for this period. I think it was this particular speech that Carter gave, which was malaise. A malaise had set in, and there was something about the kind of can-do American spirit that was flagging right around that time. So.
Interesting. Yeah, the oil shock. There's an interesting post by Nick Szabo about what he calls the Malthusian scares, where basically, I think the theory behind it is because we mess around with money. Now you have this fiat system. People try to go into other sources to save wealth, and oil was one of them. But going a little bit further into the thesis energy. So NEPA, I think its jurisdiction is in the US, right? And I've seen graphs of like nuclear power plants in Korea. For example, I think France, for the longest time, most of its energy was nuclear. And a counter argument could be made. Look, if it was only regulation, wouldn't these other countries see energy prices go down significantly? Could it be that it's just like lack of innovation? Because like people are also against cars, and even though some people are against cars, you see 14 million new cars being sold every year in the US because of price and convenience. Could it be just that we don't like, it's too pricey to create a nuclear reactor? You know, you need these governments to be involved, and maybe small modular reactors can actually help there, or like energy production is not cheap enough with nuclear. Could that be the case, or is it uh, more related to, you know, cultural and the decision of humans not to make energy cheaper?
Yeah, so I've talked mostly about the US because that's where I know the story in the most detail. But similar things happen certainly throughout the Western world. And the fundamental ideas were not purely US ideas. And I think the same conversation about progress was happening throughout the Western world. I mean, a lot of it really was this conversation, this kind of reassessment, this questioning of the very idea of progress really began with the world wars. It really began with World War One. And so it certainly happened in Europe as much as in the West. Europe thought that in 1914, Europe thought that they were the height of civilization, the most advanced countries in the world. They were the most scientifically and technically advanced. They had the best economies. They thought they were the home of enlightened thinking. And then they all went to war against each other and dragged the entire world in with them to one of the most terrible and violent conflicts in a long time. And so that was a real shock. And they had to, and a lot of people had to reassess this notion of progress. A lot of people had assumed that moral and social progress were happening just alongside and just as fast as scientific and technical progress. A lot of people assumed or thought that those things somehow were linked, that they went hand in hand, and that they would inevitably kind of advance together. And then what they found out was that they had actually, in actual fact, science and technology had advanced very far, and our societies were still stuck in the age of empires. And those empires went to war against each other. So this same kind of questioning and skepticism of progress was true throughout the West. You mentioned with nuclear, it's true. France was able to build a lot of nuclear, and until recently, got some 75 or 80% of their power from it, their electricity from it, at least. Korea in more recent decades has been able to build on a reasonable cost. I mean, if you look across the industrially developed nations that are going to even think about building nuclear power plants, costs went up in almost all of them, but to different degrees. The US had one of the worst shocks. France, I think, managed to get away with only like a factor of 2 increase. Some other places it was a factor of 5 or more. A lot of this is because, again, the whole Western world is in an ongoing conversation. And especially since the nuclear technology originated in the US, when the US was in the 60s setting sort of more and stricter and stricter rules and regulations on how to design and build plants, it was hard for the rest of the world to not follow along at least somewhat, again, especially in the context of this kind of broader conversation about whether progress is even a good thing. So I think that's why you see some of the same patterns throughout the world, even though they aren't not to the same degree everywhere. And so as for why nuclear is cheap, it's because we build it in expensive ways. There's no reason based in physics or sort of any kind of fundamental technological or economic reason why nuclear has to be expensive. It's the way that we have chosen to build it, and ultimately the way that it's the system that we got ourselves into. I mean, not all of it was a direct choice by people where they said, let's just add to the cost, check. But the way that we've done things has led to that. That's a longer story. I can try to go into more detail, if you want. But I think it's the problems in nuclear have metastasized to the entire industry, and it's really become quite sclerotic. It's not going to be easy to fix. again, there's no law of physics or economics that says that nuclear can't be very cheap, but I think it's going to be very difficult to get it there. Some people are working on it, and I'm absolutely cheering them on. But yeah, then you mentioned there might be some other technologies coming along. Solar prices are dropping exponentially and have been for a long time. And my understanding is there's no, again, fundamental physical limitation why they can't just continue to drop. Even battery prices have been dropping. And so I started off somewhat skeptical, but I'm slowly getting more optimistic about solar being part of where the energy abundance of the future can come from. Geothermal is another potential source of energy, abundant, clean, reliable energy. Unlike solar and wind, geothermal is a pretty stable source. It's not intermittent. It's not dependent on weather. It's really just dependent on drilling a very, very deep hole. Briefly, if you've heard about geothermal in the past, it's basically just getting heat from underneath the earth. To date, we have mostly been able to do this in a very few special locations geologically, like near volcanoes where the heat is very near the surface. But if you drill down deep enough, you can get to heat anywhere. If you just get close enough to the core or just go far enough under the crust, it gets pretty hot. And all you have to do is pipe water down there, heat up the water and bring it back to the surface. And then you can, you've got steam and you can drive a turbine and you can make electricity. So that just depends on, like I said, being able to drill, really deep holes and get down where we want to. And we have that technology in part because of oil and gas, right? And because of fracking and because of other techniques like that. So I'm optimistic about that. Again, if we can fix the permitting to actually allow us to build these facilities. And then the other thing you mentioned is fusion. Nuclear fusion has always been kind of a scientific research project, but there are some indications that Helion, at least, believes that they are 5 years away or less from delivering actual affordable fusion electricity. They've actually signed a contract, I think it was with Microsoft, to deliver electricity to their data centers from fusion within 5 years or pay penalties. So that is saying something about their belief in their ability to get it done, and that would be, I think, really transformative. That alone, has the potential to get us back on track for energy superabundance.
That's interesting to hear. So I think the thesis is a little bit around the West leading the way. The US led a lot the way. I just want to see flying cars. I want to live in the Jetsons world. I want to live in Star Trek. I really want cheap energy. Cool. So let's go over another area that there has been innovation over time, and that's agriculture. You told me that you've been researching lately agriculture. How have crop yields evolved over time, and were there inflection points for increasing yields in history? Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, well, so we've been talking about the last century or two, and so let's back up and zoom out and talk about the last 10 or 50 centuries. Because I've been researching the long history of agriculture, and I think the central story of agriculture is really the story of soil fertility. Soil fertility is kind of the central problem of agriculture that that different agricultural systems revolve around. And it's closely connected to the question you asked about crop yields, which you won't be surprised to hear have a long-term increasing trend over time. But the basic challenge of soil fertility is that when you plant crops, if you don't do anything else and don't do anything to kind of maintain the fertility of the soil, it degrades over time. Every harvest takes nutrients out of the soil, and the next harvest won't grow as much unless you do something to restore the fertility. So, the earliest methods of agriculture were basically to just only plant a field for a year or two, and to then abandon it for decades. and come back to it much, much later when natural processes had slowly restored the soil. And this is known as shifting agriculture because you're constantly shifting where your fields are. Typically, this would be done through slash and burn. You would do it not in fields, but in the forest. And you would literally chop down all the trees and shrubs and everything in one patch of land, make a big pile of it, set it all on fire, and then the ashes would provide some fertility and it would clear the land. And then, like I said, you could plant that for 1 or 2 harvests, maybe 3 at the most, and then you would leave it for 20, 30, up to 50 years if you had the luxury of doing so. Of course, this requires an enormous amount of land. If you're only planting for 1 or 2 years and then you're leaving it for 2 to 4 decades or something, you've only got 10% utilization of your available land or less. And so this kind of agriculture cannot really support very high population densities, right? Each tribe needs an enormous amount of land to itself. And when that tribe grows and grows too big and splits, then the other tribe has to go off and find a more distant plot of land. If you can't find more land, then what you end up doing is recropping the same land, doing slash and burn on it again, when it has not yet fully regrown. So you don't yet let it fully regrow to forest. Maybe it just regrows to bush and or small trees, and then you chop that down. Okay, you keep doing this. Eventually, you've deforested your region, and you have nothing left but grassland. And so now agriculture is sort of forced to evolve, and now you have to find new ways of restoring fertility. For a long time, this was done through animal manure. And sometimes through planting legumes, which are a special class of plants that have this very remarkable property that they actually don't decrease the fertility of the soil. They actually increase it. Most plants take nutrients out of the soil, and legumes actually give nutrients back to the soil. They're a rare class of plant that does that. Legumes are things like beans, peas, lentils, clover, alfalfa, and so planting those things would restore some fertility, and then you could plant some wheat or oats or barley or something, right? And then that would take fertility away, and you could maybe alternate those. So over time, we've kind of gotten more and more. We got more and more sophisticated systems of cropping the land, and so if you can maybe have a 2-year rotation, right, where you plant half your fields and let them grow, and then you leave them fallow for a year maybe, or you and then you kind of let some natural processes restore some fertility, or manure the land to restore fertility. Then you can use it half your land, right? So if the slash and burn lets you use 10% of your total land, maybe a 2-field rotation lets you use half the land. A 3-field rotation where you have a spring crop, a winter crop, and then 1 field fallow lets you use 2/3 of the land, right? And then ultimately, by the 18th century or so, by the end of that century, we had developed more sophisticated crop rotations using more animals, more manure, more plowing, and more legumes to basically eliminate the fallowing. So you could plant all of your land in every season. You'd still be rotating crops between different types of grain, different types of legumes, some crops grown for the livestock, some crops grown for humans consumption, and so forth. But we basically managed to get 100% utilization of the land. At that point, the only way to increase fertility and to continue to increase yields was to start adding fertilizer from external sources. And so in the 19th century, people started looking to all kinds of external inputs, and farmers actually started purchasing external inputs to apply to the fields rather than having a kind of a closed circuit system. Some of the popular ones, oil seed cakes. So when you press seeds for their oil in a kind of industrial oil making process, you end up with this residue, this kind of leftover material, and that was pressed into little cakes and then sold, and you could distribute that through your fields, and it had some nutrients in it. Bones, I know it's macabre, but bones broken into pieces or crushed into dust were a source of nutrients. And guano especially from seabirds, was another really great, probably the best natural fertilizer that was discovered in the 19th century. And as commerce was going global, people were exploring the world and finding this stuff all over. And Europeans found out that there was a huge deposits of guano off the coast of Peru, on these islands out in the Pacific Ocean. There are these places where it rarely rained, and seabirds had just been depositing guano for who knows how many centuries or millennia, and it was piled 50 feet deep, and they were just mining it like it was metal ore or something, and shipping it off. And this stuff was super great fertilizer. The only problem is that it didn't last. Like, the resources were depleted within decades. And this was a true instance of overconsumption leading to resource depletion. There was a fairly limited stock of this stuff, and within some 40 years, it was pretty much all used up. Ultimately, what happened and how we transitioned into the modern era was that chemistry discovered ways of making synthetic fertilizer out of literally from the nitrogen in the air and the hydrogen in water. From just air and water, and if you input enough energy in the right kind of chemical reaction in the right kind of pressurized container, you can turn it into ammonia, which is NH3, nitrogen and hydrogen, and that is the precursor of fertilizer and the kind of chemical that plants need. So that's like a really whirlwind tour of sort of fertilizer over the last 10,000 years. But that's kind of the central progression, and that progression has allowed us to create ever and ever higher yields. The more nutrients we can give to the crops, the more we can concentrate them on the same plot of land, and grow more and more vigorous and larger and more nutritious crops on the same piece of land. And so that's led us to, I mean, over all this period of time, effective yields for on the total land involved have increased by orders of magnitude, from tens of kilograms per hectare to maybe more like 1,000 kilograms per hectare today. So it's been an enormous increase over all that time.
That's amazing. That's super interesting that we basically got air and water, and we created food for crops, and that just shows how inventive we are.
Yeah.
So,
sorry, did I say 1,000 kilograms per hectare? I think it's more like 10,000 today. So
wow,
it's really been a few, almost 3 orders of magnitude.
that's amazing. So uh, I I think it's interesting how much we increase crop yields. And one interesting thing that I saw, for example, is that Netherlands, which is a small country, is like the second biggest exporter of agricultural goods, right behind the US. And it's a very small country, right? Like at the beginning, you're mentioning about these tribes that they had to split because uh, they needed more land. And right now we have a very small country uh, producing so many goods for the world. And another interesting thing that I've seen is that, for example, in Europe, Europe is more green right now than 100 years ago. And I think in part is probably land usage. For example, our agriculture, probably we need a lot less land and for producing the same goods. But I mean, you mentioned a little bit about how tribes, you know, they used to behave because of production of food, and now we don't need to split societies because of that. But are there other, second order effects of this increase of agricultural yields? And have prices, because of these yields, because of these orders of magnitude increase, have prices gone down in, let's say, in the past 100 years, obviously inflation adjusted? And if so, or if not, why?
Oh yeah, prices have gone down enormously, because it requires so much less labor. So we've mostly been talking about yields and fertility. So this is mostly about it takes less land now to feed people than it used to, and the main second order effect of that is allowing for greater population density. Um, but the other thing, one thing we haven't talked about is mechanization. With the mechanization of agriculture and the application of modern energy sources and engines and machines to agriculture, the labor requirements, the labor have gone down by orders of magnitude. Or another way of saying that, the labor productivity of an individual agricultural worker has gone up by orders of magnitude. And so, even just at harvest time, what previously took 100 men with scythes cutting down harvesting wheat by hand in the fields, kind of advancing laboriously one step at a time, one swipe of the scythe at a time to cut down the wheat. Now a single person can do the work of 100 by driving forward a large gasoline and engine powered combine harvester that has the width of 10 men with scythes and can move forward 10 times faster than them. So you get 100 times the productivity. If you ever look up YouTube videos of combine harvesters, by the way, there's really great drone footage, and it's an amazing sight to see. It's just this huge machine cutting this enormous swath through a field of wheat at an amazing pace, and just literally pouring out a torrent of grain. They have to run. There's basically a truck driving alongside the harvester machine to just catch all of the grain that it's pouring out in this enormous flood. And then eventually the truck gets full and it has to drive off, and another truck has to come up to catch more grain, because that's just how much we're producing. So because of the incredible land productivity and labor productivity that we have today, food prices have come down enormously, and you can see this in historical data. You can see it in the proportion of each family's income that they spend on food. It used to be a very large part of every family's budget would go to just buying food. A lot of which, by the way, they had to make at home themselves. So there was a lot more cooking done from scratch in ways that we don't have to do today. Even if you like cooking today, you probably buy pre-made pasta and sauces and all kinds of things like that. You don't have to literally make all that stuff from grain and from raw produce and so forth. Today the median family is going to spend a much smaller percentage of their income on food than they used to, which frees up income, of course, for everything else in life: housing, clothing, entertainment, travel, education, all kinds of things.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen a stat that I think was 50% of people's income, and right now is around 11% or around 10%. But I wonder if that's, also there's productivity gains, like people increase their wages, So, there are two factors there, right? It's amazing how much we've improved as well. You mentioned mechanization, and I think in the US, in the beginning of 1900s, you probably know this better, there was a huge percentage of the population that was working on agriculture, and right now it's a much smaller percentage. So that definitely shows progress there.
Historically, in the Middle Ages, there would be easily something like 50 to 75% of the workforce would be in agriculture, because again of the labor productivity. One farm family working full time could only produce enough food to feed themselves and at most like one other family. So if you didn't have at least half of your population working in agriculture, then you didn't have enough food to feed your civilization. Today that is, in the US, I think it's more like 3% of the workforce in agriculture. Even as late as I think 1870, almost half or around half the U.S. workforce was in agriculture. So now it's down to just a few percent, and it wouldn't even have to be as much as 3% if we really wanted to minimize it. But now, of course, we want to produce all kinds of food and different kinds of crops, and we've gone beyond mere subsistence to now wanting enjoyment and pleasure from food as well. So that keeps us at something like 3%.
That's great progress. So let's go back to inventions and in history. I mean, you had so many inventions, and I mean, where were most inventions created? Was it academia? Was it, in big corporations, big R&D labs, or is it mostly new companies? Or how are new inventions created?
This has changed a lot over time. Um, you know, in the ancient and medieval period, we honestly don't really know who created most of the major inventions. We don't know who invented the plow or the spinning wheel or a lot of other kind of things like that were pretty important, because just records weren't kept. There were no economic historians. There were no historians really. Maybe a few historians, but they're just um, we just don't have the information. But there were no research labs either, right? So and universities didn't research inventions really. Again, I'm talking about kind of Middle Ages. Um, Once we got into the what historians call the modern era, right, meaning roughly the last 500 years ish. Um, then things start to change and things are different. In the 1600s, you get explicit societies like the Royal Society, organized around science and technology, and you get people more. There was a whole idea that came about, most famously expressed by Francis Bacon, that knowledge should be useful, and that growing our knowledge would lead to improvements in the arts and in technology. And so people started to deliberately try to collect best practice and disseminate best practices. They tried to experiment with with the, and I mean, again, it's not that zero of this happened in the past, um but it got more systematic, and it got more more and more investment started to go into it. Right, by the time you get to the 18th and 19th century, you have people deliberately investing money into inventive enterprises. If you look at the textile machinery that was invented in the 18th century, that really kind of kicked off the automation revolution, portion of the industrial revolution. Some of those projects took years, and tens of thousands of British pounds were invested in them in order to pay craftsmen like clockmakers who knew how to make the delicate and precision gears that had to go into some of these machines, and other kinds of metal workers and woodworkers and so forth to construct these machines, and people just tinkering with stuff for a long time. But often it was done, at people's own expense, or they had what today we would call an angel investor, right? One wealthy person who put in the money, sometimes hoping to get a patent out of it and then use the patent to make a business. By the late 19th century, this is pretty well formalized and established, that inventors tinker in their garage or at home or in their backyard. Maybe they get some friend or a family member to fund them, and then once they get a patent, they can get maybe a banker to create a corporation with them, and and give them some shares in exchange for their patent, and then they're off and running. Um, Academic research, the research university as we know it today, really wasn't created until the 1800s and wasn't widespread until the late 1800s. I would say corporate research labs are really a 20th century phenomenon. For even well in into the early 20th century, corporations would mostly buy inventions from independent inventors, and in fact, the first or hire them as consultants. But they mostly weren't in the business of improving their own products through fundamental invention. They would wait, even if they had a sense of what improvements needed to be made. They would kind of wait and watch and let independent inventors take the risk and do the sort of crazy experimentation. And then when one of them had an improvement to make, they'd come and they would sell it to the company that might actually manufacture it. In fact, the very first corporate research labs were really set up as testing labs for, kind of validation and quality assurance for the inventions that were brought into them externally from independent inventors. By the early to middle of the 20th century, corporations start to bring the invention in-house. And certainly by the 30s, if not earlier, some of it starting earlier, you get the kind of in-house, research lab. Edison is kind of famous for creating one of the first really industrial research labs. He had sort of an invention factory. And then, AT&T, I think it was, Bell, or maybe it was still Bell, no, it was Bell Telephone Company, had a research lab fairly early on. DuPont had really amazing stuff in chemistry in the 1930s. General Electric had a research lab. Kodak had a research lab. Later on, Bell Labs was very famous, especially for the things they did in the 40s. They invented the transistor. Xerox PARC, later on especially in the 60s, with some of the foundations of the personal computer. So these were kind of all the things that corporate research did. Corporate research labs sort of fell from prominence after the 60s or 70s. And by the 80s or 90s, they were definitely on the decline. They're still around, but just not doing the same kind of bold, ambitious things, not getting the same deep investment and long-term investment to really do fundamental research. Corporate research labs used to win Nobel Prizes. They used to contribute to science. They used to publish as many papers as universities did. And that just doesn't really happen anymore, except maybe in artificial intelligence, where we're still seeing corporate labs, pushing the frontier. What happened after World War II was a major ramp up in federal funding for science. And so after World War II, science really became federalized, centralized under the federal bureaucracy. And today, and again, at least in the U.S., I'm mostly telling a U.S.-centric history here. A lot of science is funded through federal funding. That a lot of it flows through university research grants.
Interesting. Could be that the reason why some of the innovations have stopped. So, you mentioned, for example, AI, right? If you think about most of the innovation, it comes from the corporate world. So, if you think about OpenAI, it's been funded, by Microsoft. It has some profit motive. If you think about, Microsoft and Facebook, the Google with DeepMind, and then, right, the areas that you mentioned that we've seen some progress seem to be mostly outside of academia. In some ways, I think you're academic in some ways, because you're studying progress, and I think a lot of the research that you do is really, really, really important. And but you're outside of academia, right? And if you think about the other areas where there hasn't been much progress, it's in areas where there hasn't been much involvement in from the corporate world, and it's mostly academia. And more recently, we've seen some progress in some other areas. So nuclear fusion, you mentioned helium, right? And there are so many now startups. If you think about space, there's SpaceX. If you think about now battery improvements, there are companies involved in it. So could it be that there is a lot of the progress has been has stopped because of that change in funding?
Okay, so first off, one clarification. Yeah, I'm not an academic. I make great use of work that is done in academia on economic history and many related fields, but I'm more of a my role is more to summarize, synthesize, and popularize kind of the best of what has been figured out about progress, and to put it together into a worldview, and to try to communicate that to a broad audience. I don't think it's as simple as quite as simple as the picture you're painting. It's certainly not the case, and I think it's a little unfair to academia. It's certainly not the case that all progress has come outside of academia and academia hasn't been doing anything. Um, you know, I mean, mRNA research, a lot of that came out of academia. I don't think it's true that I don't think you can credit corporate labs for all the progress in AI. They've made a lot of progress recently in recent years, but a lot of that was built on things that were discovered in academia. So there's still a lot that universities do, and that the general kind of academic, complex does to advance science. There is a natural kind of progression where the science of some field maybe has to get figured out first before there's even enough to begin tinkering with. And then once the tinkering can begin, then maybe there's a point where where for-profit enterprises and corporate labs and so forth kind of take it on and start moving faster with it. But that is often built on a foundation of what was figured out within kind of the scientific establishment. So I think you always want to, if you only look at, well, who came up with an invention and it was always a corporate lab, and then you conclude all progress is made by corporate labs, then I think you're sort of missing some of the underpinnings there. You can say, it was Pfizer and Moderna and BioNTech who created the mRNA vaccines. But, again, that was built on a lot of academic biology research to figure out how mRNA works and techniques for using it and so forth. So there is a division of labor there, and there is a partnership. All that said, I do think that academia could probably be moving faster to advance science itself, and I do think that if assuming there is inefficiency there, which I think there is, that a lot of it does come from the sort of the funding structure of science today, and more broadly, kind of the just the way that science is organized and managed, and the incentive structures that we have in place. I think that funding has become a little bit too centralized and bureaucratized. There's a little bit too much reliance on a small number of large sources. Most obviously, in the US, the NIH is the largest science funder and is the dominant science funder in biomedical research. And I think when you have a single funder, no matter how wonderful of a job they are doing, and no matter how smart and high judgment they are, that one funder will always have some blind spots. And so it's true of any person or organization or process. Nobody can perfectly forecast where all progress is going to come from. And so when there's one dominant funder, what happens is anywhere they have a blind spot, progress is cut off in that down that path, because it's very difficult to get funding for it. And so, I think it's better to have a world with sort of that's more diversified and more heterogeneous in terms of having more federated in terms of having a larger number of funders, no one of which dominates the scene. Because then if work doesn't get funded down from one funder, then they can just shop it around to somebody who actually believes in them. Something like this happened in agriculture in the early 20th century. So going back to our discussion of agriculture and crop yields, the other major input factor affecting crop yields we haven't talked about, by the way, is breeding. One of the biggest successes of 20th century breeding was hybrid corn. And the work on hybrid corn, on corn breeding, was going on at a state agricultural experiment station. I don't remember which one off the top of my head, unfortunately. But at one point, the the research manager there basically decided that this was not a promising project and that he wasn't going to fund it anymore. And the guy who was doing it believed in it and just picked up and went to a different state. So when you have it more federated at the state level that way, there's more. I mean, a similar thing happens in the tech and startup world, or in the more broadly in sort of the for-profit world of startups and VC. There's no one VC that all the money comes from. There are many top VCs, and you can shop around to all of them. And some of them are always going to tell you no. And then, but you only really need one to lead your investment to make a success. And then on top of that, you can say, all right, well, our core research agencies like NIH and NSF if they are going to dominate, how good of a job are they doing, and how good are the methods that they use? And one challenge here is that the main method that they use for deciding who gets grants is a sort of committee-based peer review process. And unfortunately, review by committee is the sort of thing that just lends itself to consensus and groupthink, not to finding the kind of breakthrough ideas that are actually going to challenge dominant paradigms, right, and change the status quo. Especially when you realize that essentially what you're doing is you are having each proposal reviewed by the experts in the field who established the status quo and who's are personally threatened if it changes, right? It's a little bit like having every new corporation, instead of appealing to VCs for funding, appeal to all of their potential competitors. If every new company had to get funded by its direct competitors that it was going to threaten, then we wouldn't see a lot of startups. And then on top of that, I think really what we have, what all of this has encouraged is an environment in which researchers do not feel a lot of academic freedom. They don't feel that they have the ability to take their research in the direction that they think is most promising. Because another feature of these grants, by the way, is that you often get the grants for very specific purposes, and you are not allowed to apply the money to anything else. So you have to decide in advance what you're going to do before you've started experimenting or learning about where the path is going to take you, and you don't have a lot of flexibility to sort of change your mind and follow new leads. Researchers are also generally encouraged to choose pretty conservative sure bets, and to do fairly safe incremental work when we really need a little bit more of the kind of high risk, high reward, potentially very transformative stuff. Those are a few brief, high level comments on kind of how the, how science, maybe has run into inefficiencies today.
Yeah. I think those are great examples. mRNA, there's CRISPR, there's like T cells, and I definitely agree with you there that you have to create a base layer, and there's a lot of progress that happens that is not immediate clear, but eventually the results come. So one last question, and one last topic that I want to talk about is the Roots of Progress Fellowship. So can you talk a little bit more about the Roots of Progress Fellowship, what it is, and how to apply?
Yeah. So the Roots of Progress is now a nonprofit organization that grew out of my writing and speaking on this topic. Our overall mission is to establish a new philosophy of progress for the 21st century, to bring about a new way of thinking about progress, a new attitude towards progress, a new concept of our relationship to nature, and of the role of technology in society and in our lives. And I think we need to, after kind of what I described in the 20th century in terms of people becoming more fearful, skeptical, defeatist, and fatalistic about progress, I think it's time to regroup, reassess those ideas, and go forward on a more humanistic basis, and with a belief that we actually have the agency to shape the future and to make a better world, to create a real technological future that we actually want to live in and are inspired to build. And to that end, the main thing that we do, our central strategy, is to develop the next generation of intellectuals who are going to advance the idea of human progress, both help the world to understand progress better and to appreciate it more, because I think too often we take it completely for granted. So the core program that does that is a fellowship program. We just launched the first cohort of the Roots of Progress Fellowship through a program that we're calling the Blog Building Intensive. It's for people who want to write essays and posts on a personal blog about progress. And we just announced a few weeks ago the first cohort, 20 up-and-coming, very talented progress writers. and they've just actually this past week put out some of their first essays under the program, and you can check out some of them on their websites and also on the Progress Forum, which you'll find at progressforum.org. And yeah, we are helping them through this 8-week intensive period. We're meeting every week. We have a peer group meeting. We do one-on-ones. We are giving them writing, instruction, and coaching, helping them to increase the quantity and the quality of their writing. We're training them in how to promote themselves, to grow their audience and their influence over time. And we are connecting them to each other and to a broader network of mentors and advisors. We've got a great lineup of advisors for the program, folks like Tyler Cowen at the Mercatus Center at George Mason, Steven Pinker at Harvard, author of Enlightenment Now, Virginia Postrel, Derek Thompson of The Atlantic, and a lot of other great folks you can see on the Roots of Progress Fellowship website. And so all those folks are making themselves available for question and answer sessions and for sort of general advice. And then, yeah, the program is running right now as an 8-week program, but when it ends, the fellowship doesn't really end. The folks who've been through this will be kind of alumni of the program for life. They will be in our sights and in our thoughts, and we will be we're dedicated to their success over the long term. Our goal is to make them into public intellectuals who are helping to advance, again, understanding and appreciation of progress in their respective areas. They have a broad range of topic areas, everything from housing policy to nuclear power to longevity technology to what is the meaning of utopia and how do we design the ideal civilization. And so it's a broad range of things. I'm really excited by the set of stuff that they're doing and proud of the work that they're putting out. And so encourage everybody to check it out. If you're interested in this kind of thing for yourself, if you would like to advance ideas of progress, whether through writing or through a podcast or through video or through storytelling or through any medium, I encourage you to get in touch. We will be launching more cohorts next year. And so I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. You can find it on Substack. Just search for the Roots of Progress. And that is the best way to be one of the first people to hear when we announce future cohorts. You can also follow me on Twitter and Threads and other social media platforms. My handle is typically Jason Crawford on all of those. Yeah, and we are also we have just launched a fundraising campaign for 2024 and beyond to keep this program going and to expand it. We're looking to raise $500,000 by the end of this year and a total of $10 million over the next 3 years in order to grow and expand this fellowship and bring hundreds and over the years thousands of intellectuals into this progress network. So if you are interested in supporting us at any level, also please check out rootsofprogress.org and find out how to support us.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. It was a pleasure talking to you. I really, really wanted to talk to you for such a long time. I find your writing really insightful. You summarize really interesting ideas, and I really, really enjoy your work. So anyone out there that want to learn a little bit about progress in society, I really recommend Roots of Progress. Follow him on Twitter. Thank you so much again for your time. Really, really appreciate. And yeah, thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks a lot. I'm very happy that you enjoy my work, and it was a good conversation. Thanks for having me here.